And Nick, I will turn this over to you. Let me.
I have to get rid of a notice that popped up on my screen about recording. There we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Mita. I really appreciate the honor of being here. And when asked to do this, the first thought that came to mind was, what in the world can I possibly tell a room full of collective bargaining professionals that they don't already know? And that's certainly a relevant question. But in my circumstance, I've been away from the bargaining table for a number of years now. And during that time, I've had a chance to look at it from a different perspective as I was putting the book together that Mita mentioned, taking it apart, putting it back together, looking at what works, what doesn't work. And I believe that that process generated some insights that are worthwhile sharing with you today. What I want to do is basically three components. Part one, the overview, the 30,000 foot down to the 500 foot level, the political and economic environment in which bargaining will take place in 2023. Secondly, the bargaining process, how we will deal with this environment, and some suggestions about helping you survive the challenges that 2023 will bring. Then we'll talk about impasse mediation and get into the dispute resolution issues that go with the bargaining process. So hopefully at the end of that, you'll have had, though it may not be as happy as I'd like it to be, a pretty good look at what 2023 is going to look like. So let's start from the top down, the 30,000 foot level, the macro issues. I've noted with great interest the circus in Washington as the Republicans can't seem to elect a House Speaker, which is, I think, indicative of the divisions, the political divisions that permeate federal government at this point in time. That problem shows no sign of easing up, and it's going to continue. Let's see, where are we? State, can we go back to the first slide again, or the second slide? National level. Yeah, thank you. That's one aspect of the problem. The other aspect, and the more direct one, is inflation. Inflation, the economist in me would note that we put an awful lot of money in the economy as a consequence of the COVID pandemic. And that in turn has caused, I believe, the inflation that we're looking at now, 7.7% last year. That's a lot, an increase in the CPI. And a number that I want you to note with great concern, and that is the increase in average credit card debt. $3,600 is the average in credit card debt today, and that's gone up significantly. What it also means is that the buying power of the dollars that your clients have, be they institutional clients or individual clients, has declined, and that causes a lot of pressure on them. So the continuing inflation is problematic at every level of government, particularly in the public sector, because unlike the private sector, there is no, you can't increase the price of the Big Mac because of the increase in the wages for the people who make them. Public sector has much less elasticity in that regard, and it's going to be a problem at the bargaining table. Okay, let's look at the state level now. The state level is also not so pretty. The Republicans again control every aspect of state government, including the legislature, the Supreme Court, and every elected administrative office. Those circumstances, I think, in particular for public sector unions and for school districts, we'll get to that, but public sector unions create a threat of legislative limitation to bargaining ability. It's out there. It's going to be hanging over your heads throughout, and hopefully it won't become a reality. But nonetheless, it's out there. So there is that. The extensive control also suggests that there's unlikely to be any meaningful reform legislation going on in the state of Ohio. And in fact, what we're going to get, I think, is more continuation of what we've had in the past, which is politically motivated legislation that doesn't do much good, in my opinion, for anybody. So, but that's the political political environment. The economic environment in the state of Ohio continues to decline, and I don't see any way that that's going to change. But that again is a macro issue. So let's look at the local level. How is that affected by all of these circumstances? And in fact, it is. We're seeing local elective positions on school boards that are being hotly contested where they never were before. We're seeing inflationary costs of living increases bringing more pressure on labor at the local level as well. Unions have lost agency fees, which is, I'm sure, a significant economic impact and another pressure point. So not only have you lost agency fees, but now you have a constituency that is seeing its income shrink as a result of inflation, and yet you're dealing with a management that has little ability, if any, to pass on the cost of increasing operating expenses. So, and the divisions are increasing there as well. The division seems to be the byword of the year on both sides of the table. So there is that. Add to it the impact of labor shortages. Mita raised a good question the other night. What's the effect of the mass resignation, if in fact there is one? And certainly we're seeing it in the private sector. In the public sector, I think what we're seeing are more job shortages, more unfilled positions, and more pressure on the existing labor force to do more work for the same level of pay, which again will tend to create a greater deal of unrest. So there are at every level of government political divisions that are increasing, and economic pressure that flow not only from inflation, but from the cost of the war in Ukraine, which is also a significant factor in the national and state level economy as well. So lots of pressure. Let's go to the next one, the school slide, Mita. I want to read you this quote, which I think summarizes very well the battle that's going on for the hearts and minds of children in public schools. The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Abraham Lincoln. I believe he was absolutely right, and I believe that the wisdom of that continues today, which describes why we're seeing so much dissent on boards of education and in the legislature. It is clear to me, again, personal opinion, that for the most part, this legislature does not like public education and has pretty much set about to destroy at least the essence of it by diminishing it with charter schools and vouchers. And the forthcoming voucher legislation will further drain public schools, public school pupils, many of them from the urban centers, if you will, paving the road for the white flight highway. They're going to be gone, and the only ones still there are those who can't leave. Charter schools we've had with us for years. We know that they don't work very well, but yet they will continue to be a significant aspect. And again, draining pupils out of the public school base. And ultimately what that will mean is also the loss of teaching employees, non-teaching employees, and loss of funds flowing to public schools from the legislature. Some of the political legislative things that we've seen already and will likely continue to see are arming teachers in the classroom, attempts to limit classroom discussions on political lines, don't say gay, don't comment on critical race theory, etc. It's only a matter of time till these things find their way to the bargaining table, and you folks are, those of you who represent teacher unions, are going to find yourselves being asked to pick up that gauntlet and protect your teachers from arbitrary dismissal for violating what I would believe to be ridiculous legislation. But it's coming. It's going to be there, and get ready for it. So next slide, please. Bargaining considerations. What do you as the bargaining professional do? How do you get ready to bargain in light of these circumstances? Well, some suggestions. Number one, try to get in the game as early as you can. And let me explain why. Bargaining teams create expectations. They operate with expectations, and the expectations come not only from their constituents, but from their own experiences, as well as the people they rely on for guidance. If the expectation is, I'm going to get a 15% raise, then every proposal that relates to money will be measured against that expectation. And if it's nowhere near 15%, they're going to be disappointed, unhappy, and believe the process isn't working well for them. So getting involved can at least give you the opportunity to inject reasonableness into the expectation. My advice to boards of education has been, you can probably have almost anything you want, but everything has a price. and you better understand what the price is before you ask for it. I think that's true on both sides of the table. And so the sooner you can get involved and control or at least guide expectations, the better off you're going to be. Secondly, encourage reasonable positions on the part of your team. The more out of sync they become, the more they jack themselves up into believing that they're actually going to be able to do that, the more difficult your job is ultimately going to be. So that's part of it. I make a reference in the slide to the confidentiality, and this brings to mind a situation in which a Board of Education issued a press release loudly proclaiming that they intended to reduce teacher pay by 3% in the forthcoming year, not mentioning details such as negotiations or contracted pay obligations, which of course brought forth a great deal of unhappiness from the bargaining unit and ultimately led to a strike that might have been avoided. I think the expectations that are formulated are great, but keep them under your hat, keep them at the bargaining table where they belong, and don't put them out there in search of public approval or disapproval, as the case may be. So in that regard, I also believe one of the best things you can do is establish bargaining style at the earliest possible time, because bargaining style will affect your preparation as well as what goes on at the bargaining table, and getting that under control is the best thing you can do. So let's talk about bargaining style with the next slide, if we may. Vita, next slide. Okay. All right, here we go. Traditional bargaining. Traditional bargaining is what I refer to as the smoke-filled room. We don't smoke anymore, but I was bargaining when we did, and had my little portable ashtray in the school library, which or the cafeteria or the bus barn or wherever it is we were, as did the representatives on the other side and most of the bargaining teams as well. But the smoke-filled room, it's how we did it. Each side had demands. They wrote them down in contract language form. They made a big pile of them because every demand expected a reply and ultimately concession. And so the more demands you had, the more you could expect to walk away from the table with. It was unlimited in terms of number, and the only real concern was were they bargainable issues, and scope of bargaining in Ohio is pretty broad. So there were a lot of demands. No limitation on how many there would be, and each demand, if agreed to, was met by a signed statement, tentative agreement initialed by both sides, reflecting the what had been agreed to in that case. Caucuses, getting away from the table and meeting with your team, were available at any time, and it was not uncommon to have caucuses that took more time than the time at the bargaining table. That's just what happened. In the discussions at the table, as you folks know, the lead negotiator led the discussions, and the members of the team, unless pre-scheduled to do so, usually said nothing, but reacted personally, quietly to what was being said. Usually in traditional bargaining and sometimes in IBB bargaining, one member of each team became the secretary who took notes, and those notes were retained as part of the records for the future in the event that the arbitrations over the meaning of some provision of the contract occurred, which they often did years later, and those notes were invaluable regard to establish what was actually intended. So could we go to the next slide? Okay. Interest-based bargaining, IBB. Turn the page. It's a different game, and one that I believe has worked well for many people. Developed by the FMCS based on the win-win theories of bargaining. It's focused not on demands, but rather on interests, which is the interest-based bargaining concept. It's different in many ways. One, usually a pre-bargaining meeting involving the bargaining teams for both sides in the same room at a training meeting led by a federal mediator. And the meeting is intended to incorporate in everyone the notion of how IBB or interest-based bargaining is intended to work, what their role is in the process, and how to prepare for and make it effective. Different also in the role of the team members. In the IBB sessions, team members do the talking, and the bargaining professionals do what? Well, hopefully they draft the language for provisions that are agreed to. There are no proposals. The paper chase of demand, of proposal, counter proposal, counter proposal is gone from IBB. And instead, there are interests that are verbalized in the bargaining session and usually caught on a computer chart or a flip chart by the mediator who is leading the discussions. So it truly is something that involves directly all the members of the bargaining unit with the professionals as facilitators, as drafters of agreements, as they evolve through the process, but not so much leading the discussions as in traditional bargaining. Much different. One of the other significant differences is the limitation of issues. Usually 10 to 12 issues exclusive of salary and benefit issues. And they're not issues. Let me give you an example. Suppose, for example, in traditional bargaining, I think we talked about the 15% pay raise. That's a demand. I want a 15% pay raise. In IBB bargaining, that demand would morph into something more like, how do we provide an economically reasonable and fair compensation for the employees of the bargaining unit? Vague, yes. General, yes. But it lends itself to a universe of possibilities. Possibilities that could include a pay raise, it could include additional benefits, it could include all kinds of creative solutions that are yet to be determined at the bargaining table. And understanding those differences is critical to participating in the process. So that's the IBB side. Could we go to the next side, please? Hybrid. Why would we want a hybrid? Well, I IBB bargaining, as great as it sounds, and in fact, in my experience, it's been a good process, isn't right for everyone, and certainly isn't right for every issue. Inevitably, despite the good intentions of all parties, negotiations related to salary and benefits tend to break down into issue-based discussions. It's money, after all. How much am I going to get? How much are you going to pay? It's money, and those issues are hard to conceptualize into interests when you get down to the nitty gritty. So it turns out that often those discussions become much more like traditional bargaining than interest-based bargaining. And recognizing that, some groups will decide, let's divide the issues and treat the salary and benefit issues as traditional bargaining and the other issues as IBB issues. And that term, the term hybrid bargaining, has been applied to that. It works, I think, and is useful for people who recognize the problems. So can we go to the next slide, please? All right. Selecting the style, and this is where kind of the rubber meets the road. IBB bargaining isn't for everyone. I've had bargaining with teams, the members of which had been on the bargaining team for the last 15 or 20 years. They did traditional bargaining, and by God, they're not about to change. That's a fact, and you really can't change it. So take that into account. On the other hand, there are reasons for going to IBB bargaining, which is certainly obvious from the process. But look to the past, look to your contract first. Does the contract specify a bargaining style? It could, many of them don't, but it could. And that would become the default. If it doesn't specify a bargaining style, what have you done in the past? If you did IBB the last time, it ought to be much easier to move directly to IBB bargaining this time. Past practice is helpful. Look at what other districts in the area have done. That's also relevant in many cases. Look on your slide at the bold language. And this is whatever you take away from this morning session. Put this one on the masthead, because it's probably one of the most important points I want to make. And that is that both sides have to agree to the style and bargain using the agreed style. If one side is bargaining with traditional bargaining techniques and the other trying to bargain with IBB techniques, you have a recipe for disaster. And unless you get it fixed quickly, or the mediator gets it fixed, trouble is lying in your future. So is IBB right for you? Well, consider the relationships you're dealing with. Some districts come to the bargaining table with the expectation there's going to be a strike because of whatever has happened in the past under the current contract. And if that's the framework in which you're operating, IBB is going to be a disappointment for you. What's the fiscal condition? If the enterprise is broke and looking at takebacks, and of course the bargaining unit is looking for substantial increases that are simply not available from existing revenue, you're going to have some problems, and maybe IBB is not right for you. And finally, can your team adapt? And that, I think, is one of the most important things as well. In a lot of cases where bargaining teams can't decide, and it's a joint decision. Neither side has the unilateral right to say, we're going to bargain using traditional bargaining, and that's it. It's a joint decision, and it needs to be a joint decision. But if they can't decide, one strategy that has proved very helpful is to have both bargaining teams undergo the IBB training without committing to the ultimate style to be selected, but do the training and then see after they've had that training whether or not they're willing to engage in IBB. Usually that will be the choice, but not always, certainly. But that's an option for you. So I mentioned also for management, costing is critical for every proposal, and a good treasurer is priceless. Having a spreadsheet that is accurate, that can be quickly produce the end result of a 1% pay raise or whatever percent it may be, is invaluable in the bargaining process. And usually that falls to the treasurer. Some treasurers are incredibly good at that. Others have not been, but it's a capability that I think is essential for management bargaining. And if you don't have it, go get it, because that's something you're going to need. And the ability to cost things is critical. So let's look at the IBB preparation. First of all, bargaining issues. Remember, there are a limited number of issues. Oftentimes, both sides will focus on changes in the same general part of the contract, so that also can help you focus. But identify them early on. Make sure that your team understands the difference between a proposal and an IBB issue. Meet with them to discuss how IBB issues are raised, how interests are presented. And here's the most important part of the preparation, I think, in IBB bargaining, is that usually a team member will be assigned as a spokesperson for each interest that is to be advanced, not only for their team, but also each interest that we know is being advanced by the other team. How do we know that? Because we've exchanged them in advance of bargaining, and our preparation has that information available to deal with. So make sure you have people who know what it is there is expected of them. If, for example, the interest is relates somehow to the starting time of the school day, a principal in charge of a middle school or a high school or even an elementary school would be the appropriate person to carry that interest and be prepared to talk about the implications of it, how it's good, how it's bad, etc. What happens in IBB bargaining is that each interest, as it's brought forward in the discussion, goes up on that flip chart or on that computer screen. And each proposed solution is then evaluated against those interests. If the solution satisfies an interest of both teams, it may well be an acceptable solution. If it only satisfies the interest of one team but not the other, it probably isn't going to be an acceptable solution. But that's how issues get resolved in IBB. So if your side has an interest in what's being discussed and no one offers that interest in the bargaining session, it won't be up there, it won't be evaluated, and simply won't become a factor in deciding whether a proposal is going to be workable or not. That's critical that your team be aware of this and prepared to offer the interests of your side as that discussion ensues. And in fact, I've even used mock bargaining techniques with as training for the IBB team. This, of course, is all team training, not joint bargaining or joint training, but team training. And the goal is to make them comfortable with what's expected of them, what you want them to do, and how they are going to respond to things. Make sure they understand that if they see some proposed solution that works counter to the interests of your side of the table, that they're prepared to recognize that and articulate it, and make sure that it's part of the consideration in IBB bargaining. So let's say that we're now prepared for IBB bargaining and go on to the next slide. Traditional bargaining. Well, again, the differences become obvious because there's no limit. There's no 10 or 12 issue limit. There is the expectation that demands will be made, and usually a lot of them, because bargaining positions, it's generally believed, are enhanced by the number of demands that are made by each side. So whether they're significant or not, lots of demands come to the table, and the process becomes one of trying to sort out which ones are really substantive and which are there to position the team for bargaining advantage. So you get lots of bargaining issues. Reviewing the contract, polling for management, polling administrators to find out what operational problems they've had. For the union, polling their membership to find out what problems they have had with the existing contract, and using the results of those to develop your proposals. Comparative data is critical. It's actually critical in both bargaining models, but certainly in traditional bargaining, knowing how your enterprise compares with other similar enterprises in the area is really important. Knowing what the history of bargaining has been for your enterprise is really important. Knowing the economic data that will govern the management for the period of the contract. Contracts that can be 3 years long generally encompass a time far beyond the ability of the fiscal officer to project revenue. State revenue is the result of a biennial budget, which won't happen for the next 2 years until sometime in April or May. So that's an unknown. Local tax collections are always an unknown, as are the proceeds of income taxes. So it's extremely difficult to project revenue, but whatever you have available, if you happen to have the Intel factory in your backyard and an income tax levy on the books, some additional revenue might be projectable. Otherwise, maybe not so much, but gathering that data as early as possible and having it available to the bargaining process. And I'm a fan of sharing data. In the public sector, there really should be no secrets. All the records are public records. You can have them by asking for them, and there's no advantage to trying to hide stuff. Some treasurers are incredibly clever at doing that, but most of them at the end of the day will decide there's really no advantage to it, and be very candid and being willing to share exactly what the circumstances of the enterprise may be. The other side of that coin, however, and we're going to move now into what happens with resolving disagreements, because let's assume we've done all that preparation, we've shared the data, we've been to the bargaining table many times, and agreement is eluding us. We have issues that are blocking issues, and by that I mean genuine issues that need to be resolved before agreement can be reached. We have other issues that probably aren't blocking issues that could go away if circumstances were right for that to occur. Deciding which is what is critical, and this is where the experience that each of you have as the bargaining professional really comes into play. Not only the experience, but hopefully the good relationships you have with your opposite number on the other side of the table, because at this point, resolving disagreements involves communication and exchange of information and building a trust factor between the professional for labor and the professional for management. If that trust factor is there and it's workable and it's operating, a lot can be accomplished in a sidebar session. If it's not there, it's only going to make things worse. So disagreements happen. What do you do about it? Well, point one, separate emotion from facts. Bargaining teams tend to operate on emotion on both sides. They have ideas about how the world should be and how bargaining should resolve, and those are usually more emotionally driven than fact driven. And at this point, it's important for you to help separate the facts from the emotion and focus on the facts. Identify the bargaining issues. Which ones do we think are the real issues that have to be resolved in order to get to a contract? Know for sure what it is you're disagreeing about. Language is always imprecise, and sometimes people find themselves disagreeing about something without really knowing the essence of what that is. This is where the sidebar, the water cooler is your friend, in my view. Go out there with your union president or your superintendent, meet over the water cooler and have an off the record candid discussion about what do you really mean, what do you really want, and that can be incredibly helpful in moving discussions forward. Also, the fear factor. Know what it is and how to address it. What do I mean by the fear factor? Well, here's a little bit of an example. We were in the midst of negotiating major changes to the healthcare provisions in a large school district. And the union president took me aside and said, look, I've met with my membership. They basically said, we don't care what you do in bargaining, but don't mess with the health plan. And here you are asking me to agree to all these changes. And if I take this back, they will lynch me at the meeting. So that was a genuine fear that she had. And in order, having identified that, we developed a number of strategies to help move beyond that by individual meetings with individual bargaining unit members explaining what the changes were. And the changes were good. They were necessary, but they couldn't be approved because of the fear factor. And once we moved beyond that, we got to an agreement, and we're able to move on. Finally, on the cost, one of my constant concerns is that both sides need to know and agree on the cost of a given proposal. Knowing what the cost is one thing, but agreeing on the cost is quite a different thing. And I think that it's incumbent on the bargaining professionals to make sure that if there are disagreements about the cost of a given proposal, they're identified, that the facts are identified and resolved, and the disagreement about cost, you can't change the facts. You may change your opinions about them, but you can't change the facts. And agreeing on what the relevant facts are is critical, and part of our jobs as the bargaining professionals is to help our clients get to the facts and reach agreement. Can we move on to the next one? Okay, thank you. Modifying proposals. You all probably do this all the time, but I'll mention it anyhow. When you have disagreements, there are things that can be done beyond simply, this is what I want, give it to me now. For example, time is always a variable. If the raise, for example, is 3% a year. Let's say that, for example, 3% a year, and your side doesn't. Management is unwilling to pay 3% a year. What they might do, consider stacking it, backloading it, 2, 3, and 4 in year 1, 2, and 3. If you cost it out, it's going to be somewhat less, not a lot, but some, and that might make a difference. Consider deferring benefits. We'll change the health plan next year. We'll increase vacation in 2 years, not 1 year. Time again is always a factor, and something to consider. Sometimes you can condition benefits on circumstances test at some point. For example, if the school district's carryover balance is more than X dollars on this date certain, then the salary schedule for the next year will be X. It'll be what you want, but at the same time, management has the comfort of knowing that the revenue sufficient to pay for it is going to be there. These always add uncertainty to unions. They don't like it in many cases, but at the same time, it's a way to get the benefit and still serve the comfort level of management. And of course, when all else fails, create a study committee, which is a common kick the can down the road strategy that a lot of people have used. I think I've probably been guilty of it a few times myself. So those are the things you can do. Now, what happens at the point of impasse? The ultimate dispute resolution strategies. We've now gone beyond bargaining, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move pretty fast. In mediation, as you know, a third party who comes in to help the parties resolve the dispute with no interest in the process and no benefit to be gained. Often an FMCS mediator. In IBB, you've got a mediator from day one. So the mediator has already worked with you and will understand what the issues are. In traditional bargaining, usually mediation doesn't kick in until the impasse has occurred. The mediator will meet, will explore, and they're pretty darn good at identifying what the blocking issues are, and attempt along the lines we've already talked about, and usually in many more, much more detail, to find ways to resolve them. Can we go to the next one, please? Okay. The what's your job with respect to mediation? Well, help the mediator understand the issues, help your team understand the mediation process. Many of them don't understand it, have never done it, don't know what it's about. And it's up to you to make them familiar with it and understand how important it really is, because it could be the last stop between where they are and a labor strike. And it's important to make it work if you can. One other thing, and again, take this one away from this discussion, because mediation doesn't involve always written proposals. Now we went back. Let's go forward. Okay, doesn't always involve written proposals, but more the flip chart conceptual mode. And oftentimes final agreement is reached at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning after many hours. Make sure that the agreement is reduced to writing and signed by the bargaining representatives of each side before the meeting ends, because when you wake up after a night's sleep and try to recreate exactly what it is that was agreed to and can't, you got a problem. So make sure that you get it down, get it signed while you can, and not only that, but for the ratification process as well. Let's go on to the next one. Mediation is, in my view, the most common dispute resolution procedure, but it's important to remember that Ohio law, section 4117.14, talks about a number of dispute resolution strategies. It is underscored by the last point in the statute, which is any other dispute resolution procedure the parties can agree on, which in most cases is mediation. But if they haven't agreed on a dispute resolution and filed it with CERB, either in a contract or separately, the statutory options come into play. One of the first things CERB will do is appoint a mediator, but at the same time, it may move to arbitration of disputed issues, and that can take several configurations, as you see on the slide: individual, last offer, package, whatever. This is interest arbitration. In other words, arbitration to reach agreement on the terms of a contract, as opposed to grievance arbitration. I personally am very much opposed to interest arbitration as a dispute resolution process, because both sides end up with something they've been unwilling to agree to, that has been dictated by somebody who's not responsive to either side. But that's what the legislature seems to think would be a good solution. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Fact finding, SERB fact finding. A misnomer, I believe, because fact finders don't see their role as fact finders, but rather deciders of disputed issues. Can be a fact finder. Fact finding panel can either be one person or three people at the most, selected from a SERB list. Hearings are conducted, findings of fact and recommendations are issued. And here's where it gets interesting. Next slide, please. Fact finding rejection. Why is rejection important? Well, it's important because if you don't reject it, the side that doesn't reject the fact finding recommendation is by a 2/3 vote of its membership is deemed to have accepted it. So you got it unless you reject it, and rejection has to take place within a tight time limit and by a 2/3 vote. Now, there's an interesting dilemma here, certainly from management, a board of education, for example. A 5-member board, three votes are sufficient to reject a fact-finding recommendation. But what about the union? Is it the entire bargaining unit? Is it the union membership? How do you measure all that? Well, it appears that the statute gives the right to reject to the members of the organization, the employee organization, which would be the union membership, as opposed to the bargaining unit membership, which could be significantly larger. This is important, but because for non-safety forces, the next stop is a strike if the recommendations have been rejected. Safety forces are different. Conciliation, yet another step, another hearing, another recommendation by a conciliation committee and or facilitator. I'm sorry, conciliator. And those recommendations are binding on the bargaining unit. There are a number of statutory guardrails, I call them, that define the considerations that have to go into a conciliation award. And there's also a right of appeal to the Common Pleas Court if you believe that those have not been followed carefully. But basically, conciliation is the end of the road for safety forces bargaining, and is the exchange for not having the right to strike that other employees have. So those are, I think I'm pretty much running out of time here, but those are the circumstances of bargaining in 2023. Not happy conditions and an enormous amount of responsibility on you as the bargaining professional, but at the same time, an enormous amount of opportunity. Creativity is unlimited sometimes, and your ability is limited only by your creativity and ingenuity. So with that, how about questions, if any? I can guarantee I'll listen. Answers are maybe, but we'll certainly give it a try.
Nick, I don't see any questions, and I think your presentation is really thorough, and we greatly appreciate it. It gave us the nuggets for the upcoming sessions, which will delve deeper into the topics that you just highlighted. So it's 12:04. Let's take a 5-minute break. Be back at 12:10. 12:10 for the second topic.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Mita.
you.
Thanks for having me.
Rate is so what we're going to hit is a scarcity of labor, running into the politics of austerity, and it's not going to be pleasant. I expect more strikes. I expect more things like the 70s. When they passed 4117 in the 80s, it was, as Mr. Pittner said, it's not a perfect solution to solving disputes, but it did prevent strikes. The interest arbitration or fact finding or conciliation that's in the statute had an impact on the number of strikes in the public sector, whereas the 70s was, there was a lot of school strikes, especially in the 70s. So I think that our number one problem is going to be staffing. And that means, how do we attract and maintain workers? And it can't be a focus on austerity, because there's only one labor pool in America. There's not a labor pool for the private sector and a labor pool for the public sector. You're competing with the private sector for talent. And so I think that is going to be the number one issue that we face for probably the next 10 years. They don't expect the labor market to rectify itself, especially when Washington broke. There's not going to be immigration reform in a bipartisan way. And so we are going to have a scarcity of labor, which people are competing for the same talent. I think we see that right now, especially in police officers, where jurisdictions are raiding other jurisdictions to get talent. And so that means there's going to be an escalation of pay and benefits, and it's going to run into the politics of, we don't want to raise taxes. But what happens when the politicians can't provide operations because they don't want to raise taxes? That's going to be the dilemma. Will they pay a price? I don't know. So this is where I think we're going to find ourselves. I think Mr. Pittner hit on another thing. You got to know priorities. What is the other side's priorities? What are your priorities? And I think that's going to be the major thing. If everything's a priority, and I've been on both sides where everybody thinks every issue is the priority, then nothing's a priority, and it's hard to get anything done. So let's go to good faith bargaining. So you have to meet at reasonable times. You have to confer in good faith with respect to wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment. And you have to execute a written contract. You do not have to say yes. You can go to the next slide, Nita. Okay, meet at reasonable times. That's determined by the totality of the conduct of negotiations. So, as everything that we deal with is complicated. Cases are made out of little details, and there's no general rule. So go to the next slide, Nita. Okay, good faith bargaining is when parties make an honest effort to reach an agreement. Here's some things. I'm at a bargaining table now, and I just tell them I'm not going to give you that. If you want that, you're going to have to go to fact finding and take it. And I don't see that as superficial bargaining. I'm just being clear on what I can and cannot do. And so you don't have to make a concession. I for one, am not moving off a lot of current language, because if I'm going to position myself for fact finding, current language is the fact finder safe harbor. If the employer in this negotiation cannot prove that they really need that change, the fact finder is not going to give it to them. Now, had they come in and had a different approach, we probably wouldn't be there, but they came in and wanted to rewrite the entire agreement. And so this is where we find ourselves. I think Mr. Pittner hit on something, you know, it's a recipe for disaster if one side is doing hard traditional bargaining and one side is trying to do interest-based bargaining and find the interest. I do think the future lies in the hybrid model. So go ahead, Mita, with the next slide. So this is one of the things I think we have an easier time with in the public sector. We can get the information, especially at the state level. OBM puts out reports that they have to generate for the legislature about the economy, and we can always get that information. The locals, you can request the information. I think Mr. Pittner did not hit on one thing that is really important, which is you need to look at the carryover each time. If you can look at the historic carryover, because there are employers that are extremely cautious, that always have a huge carryover, and you can show that in fact finding, to show that, you know, when you're listening to them about the politics or about the finances, you need to question the veracity of the information they're providing, because they are very extremely conservative when giving those estimates. And so I think that's important. Go ahead to the next slide. So you can request or demand information. If you know, during bargaining, if you hit an issue that you think you need some information for, that you didn't get it generally, you can request it at that time to help you make decisions. You know, in the private sector, you have to say the magic words. If you want to see the books, the employer has to say they're broke. That's not the case in the public sector. You know, you have a duty as the employer to provide information during the course of the contract and during negotiations. So the union's entitled to wage rates, seniority lists, names and addresses of employees, employee medical records. Go ahead to the next slide. So let's talk surface bargaining. Again, surface bargaining is I'm not considering any of your proposals. I've got my proposals. I'm sticking to them. I'm not moving at all. But you do not have to move. So it's really hard to distinguish between surface bargaining and hard bargaining, because there is no obligation to say yes. Okay. What you cannot do, though, is move farther apart. So you can't put a proposal on after they put a proposal on that moves even further apart. So that's the one thing that probably gets you into trouble. But the reality is you can say no. You can say, no, I'm not giving that to you. We can't entertain that proposal. And, you know, I think the problem with traditional bargaining coming into the economic and political time that we are coming into is going to be so lack, if there's too much on the table, it's going to cause a lot of fear in the bargaining units. It's going to cause a lot of consternation in the workforce, and it's going to result in more labor unrest. And so, and that's the way I see things playing out. So I would steal things from the IBB model, like limiting the number of issues you bring to the table, bringing priorities to the table as opposed to everything, focusing on some interests, like how do we recruit and retain employees in this economy. That doesn't necessarily just translate to wages. It could translate to other things, and not just wages and benefits. You know, a lot of people leave their employer because of their immediate supervisor. So some of the things that employers can do is figure out how to engage employees and make them feel wanted. So go ahead. So the insufficient authority of the negotiator, we see this all the time. You know, where somebody outside the table was actually in charge of negotiations, especially in the public sector. You know, I experienced that on both sides of this in my career. When I was on management, I had to have a meeting, you know, once a week during bargaining with 6 people from the governor's office and a couple of directors of the agency, so I could get authority to do what I had to do. But I did have some autonomy. The problem is when you have no autonomy at the table to make decisions, I think that's problematic. You know, on the union side of the table, as an advocate, I've experienced the other end of that, which is there's a lot of democracy on the union side in terms of reaching a decision. And so, you know, you have to couch your discussions with the other side. And, you know, I will see, you know, I think I can sell this. I think, but sometimes you have to tell them, I don't think I can sell this. And so I think that is a dynamic that happens. Go to the next slide, Nita. So the structure of bargaining, and this is the traditional structure. There's joint sessions with the other side. There's caucuses with your side. And then there's the other types of interactions like the sidebar. Go to the next slide, Mita. So I think Mr. Pittner covered this. I'm not going to harp on it, but you know, in the traditional bargaining, there's a chief spokesperson. That person does the talking in the joint session, and then and caucus, you know, gets information from their side. Go to the next. So the purpose of the joint session is to present and explain positions or proposals, explain offers, request information, present information, ask questions, provide answers, discuss and agree on process issues, and reach joint agreement. I kind of like the hybrid model where some issues at the table might lend themselves to an interest-based approach, not necessarily the process-laden IBB, but you know, an exploration of interest. Say some articles lend themselves to that. Some issues don't lend themselves to that, and I think you know you can mix and match the styles of bargaining that you want to use depending on the other advocate. So go to the next session, Mita. And the caucus, this is where the negotiator gets information from his team and discusses with their team the proposals of the other side and gets feedback. I think I've covered this, so let's talk about sidebars. The sidebars used to be a big part of bargaining. As Mr. Pittner said, trying to establish some trust with the other side's advocate, and trying to share some information to help them understand the dynamic that's going on at your table. I think it's harder to do. We live in post-fact America, and I found that at least the last 6 years, sidebar discussions are really hard to do because your team doesn't trust you. Your team doesn't trust the other side. They have all these conspiracy theories that everybody's out to get them, and so I think it's much harder to engage in that sidebar meeting. And so, it's easier to trust somebody when you've known them for some time. So if the other advocate is on the other side and you have a relationship, that's great. But what happens when that relationship doesn't exist and it's the first time you're dealing with somebody? So I do find that the sidebar meetings are probably disappearing from the bargaining interaction compared to where they were when I first started in 1985. So go ahead. Traditional bargaining structures and stages. You look at the contract, you have to have good communication skills, the ability to delegate. Like I said, I've experienced great bargaining where you set off a couple of the bargaining team members with a small subgroup to explore a certain issue, and they come back with a creative solution, and it gets incorporated into the contract. Mr. Pittner hit on this, and I do believe that bargaining, there's a lot of creativity to bargaining if you let there be creativity. If you're stuck with, this is all we're going to do, and you don't delve into engaging that creativity, you're not going to get as good a result. And that's been my experience. I mean, where we've made change, the changes come from both sides looking for a solution and using creativity to get there. So you have proposals, you have strategy. I mean, we've hit on this before, traditional bargaining, you flood everything with a bunch of proposals, and you try to hide what's really important. It doesn't make any sense to me. I've found that I've gotten the best results where I've said to people, this is what I need, and they tell me what they need to get to a deal when we try to figure out a way there together. If you keep trying to hide from me to what's important to see as much as you're going to get, my approach is then you're not going to get much from me during bargaining. I'm not going to move in your direction much if you're trying to see as much as you can get. If you're clear with me what's important and I'm clear with you what's important, we're going to get to a deal. Listening to the other side is a big part of it. Listening to your team to figure out, where their head is, is important. Somebody has to take notes. That's not me. I'm a horrible note taker, but I got a great memory. And I do use clarifying questions. You have to probe the other side, as opposed to just reading the proposal. You have to probe the other side to find out what's behind the proposal. What are they really looking for? One of the things I try to do as the advocate, when I'm explaining my proposal, saying this is what we came up with as a solution, but here's the interest behind it. This is what's driving that proposal, so that the other side has an idea. Maybe they have another idea that they can't live with what I proposed, but they can come back with something that I can live with. So I do think communication in that respect, if you drop the hints, or if people are listening to the hints or even care about what you're saying, it helps you get to a deal. Again, I think that hits with the formulating. Again, you have to know what the pulse of your constituents is. There are times I'm going to yell at the other advocate, and I explained that to them apart. I explained at the beginning, and I did this last time with the advocate for the state. I said, I'm going to yell at you, but you know that because I got to get these people to follow me towards the deal. They got to believe you're fighting for them. They can't just believe that you're the reasonable, rational person all the time. Think of a football coach. There's two types of football coaches. There's one that keeps calm and the kids don't really bond to him, and they don't play as hard for him. And so, there's the more animated one, and sometimes that's that gets you more with your constituency. Sometimes they just want you to say things that they want to say to the employer that they can't. So, be clear with the other advocate going into this, because I think that's really important. You don't want to have fallout because of that. But I think people that have been in this business for some time really know that is that is an issue that more so on the union side. But when I was on management side, I yelled at people too, because that's just who I am. You have to be a team player, and and the team has to know that you're fighting for them. So in traditional bargaining, again, the chief spokesperson speaks. You have to understand the proposals to explain them, or if it's something that I really wasn't involved in putting together beforehand, I might take that to someone to present. You also want to mentor people so that they can do this process too. So I think delegation sometimes it needs to be done so that you can bring people along. That's how I got brought along, and put in positions to succeed. So I think that's important for negotiators to do, for people in the labor relations field. You get input from your team away from the table. You call for caucuses when you need them. That might be strategic. Usually it's more to get information. And again, you know, sidebars were a big thing in bargaining for, I would say, you know, since I began in 1985. But the reality is, I think in the last 6 years, I think they may cause more damage than solution. So what do you do to prepare? One, I think you do have to look at the economy. Okay, you do have to know what's going on in the outside world, because that's going to drive where you're going. You do have to look at the interest of your constituents and the interest of the other side. You know, I was there when John Casey came in, and I knew that after Senate Bill 5, we had to find a way for him to save face and to move on. And so, you know, that I think that is something that people have to recognize, that you have to recognize the interests of the other side if you want to get to a deal. You gather relevant information for bargaining. You know, again, the economy, the finances, the labor market, retention, all those things will come into play. Comparisons with competitors, I think, you know, but I've seen over time is it's devolved because people don't want to agree on what are the comparables jurisdictions. People want to play games with the jurisdictions to figure out how to get the best deal, and that doesn't always lend itself. That gamesmanship doesn't lend itself to getting to a deal, because if you're using things that aren't really relevant, try to lower the price, it's not really going to work, and it doesn't lend itself to building that trust with the other side. Now, having said that, you know, traditional comparisons with this labor market, I think may be fallen by the wayside. I do think some general labor market data is going to drive some of the solutions, because again, you only have one labor market. There's not the labor market for the private sector and the public sector. You're competing for people, and those people are scarce. And so you may have to look beyond what the city next to you is paying. And you may have to look at what employers in the general area are paying. And what kind of duties are those, and you know, who am I competing with, especially at the low end. We see a lot of the wage growth recently is at the low end of the pay scale. It's at the more historically, you know, blue collar jobs, and so so if I can make $18 an hour flipping burger or cooking chicken for Cane's Chicken, and you're a public sector employer in Franklin County that's paying $13.96 an hour for a job in the Ohio in the Department of JFS, you're not going to be able to compete with that that wage, even though you have other benefits. That wage is too low to compete for talent. So I think you're going to have to look beyond just traditional comparisons and competitors. And you're going to have to develop strategies to address what happens if we don't reach an agreement. I try to position myself for fact finding. You know, I've talked to some fact finders recently, and you know, you can't take everything to fact finding. They don't like to have 35 issues, and so you should, as an advocate, be trying to narrow down those issues you take. But it all depends on the other side. You know, if they're reasonable, I can be reasonable. If they're hard, I can be hard. I think that's, you know, that's, you get what you give. And so, you know, I don't think we should ever have to take 35 issues to fact finding. I do think that we should be able, jointly, if we try to problem solve, get to where we need to be. But in this climate that we live in now, I do see a polarization that's happening politically is also happening between management and labor. And there's this polarization where, you know, both sides aren't talking to each other during the life of a contract in a constructive manner. And so that lends to much harder bargaining. You know, the union doesn't really cost a lot of things that they want. And I think that's, you know, that's a downside. Some of it's because they don't have the data to do the costing. But everybody should, as Mr. Pittner said, everybody should know what a 1% raise is. Any place I've ever went, I've made sure that I tried to figure out what is a 1% raise, because then if you know the cost of 1% raise for the bargaining unit, you can add another percent, that's the cost of 2, that's cost of 3, you know. And so I think every chief spokesperson should go into bargaining knowing what a 1% raise for that bargaining unit would be, okay? And then when you're putting your positions together to go to the bargaining table, you should be anticipating what the other parties' issues and positions are. And a lot of bargaining is trying to figure out how to satisfy some of their issues. You know, it's not just about what you want or what you need, but what is it that they need, and where is that trade, if there's a trade, or is there you know, a different way to get there. So if you have the adversarial arrangement, then you're going to have inflated initial positions, which, you know, I hate going into bargaining saying I want a 13% raise the first year when you know that's not realistic. But you know, sometimes our people think that if you ask for 13, you're going to get 7. You know, and sometimes you have to satisfy that political thing. So if I do set out inflated positions, I always try to signal to the other side that this is a placeholder, and that, you know, that that what we need is a significant raise. You know, I don't understand, but again, this idea that you need to conceal from the other party. If you're trying to get as much as possible, yes. If you really want a deal, you're going to have to tell me what you need, and you're going to have to be clear with me. Because trying to get as much as you want makes me tend to close that down by not moving very much. And as I am at this one table that I'm at right now. So, you know, if you know the other side, you know, and if they're trying to get as much as possible, then it's going to be very adversarial, and it's going to be very contentious at the table. Again, if you're looking for a reasonable deal, and you're going to set forth your priorities with the other side, and they set forth you know, they set forth their priorities with you, I think it lends itself to a much easier deal. Deadline motivates settlement. I think we do this very well at the state level. In the state contracts, we set forth in our MAD, the the deadline for traditional negotiations to end. We build in a mediation process, and we build in sessions with the mediator to happen in a time frame. Then we build in a day for a fact-finding date if we don't have resolution, because I do think deadlines tends to motivate settlement. It's just like if you schedule a case, it'll go away. If you build in a deadline, people will have to make decisions. They can't just put it off. And that helps both sides manage their team to say, hey, we have to be making decisions. We can't go back and still keep exploring this issue. We have to start making some decisions. Deadlines do that. So outcomes sometimes are determined by relative power. I think, on this side of the table, when I'm on union side, I don't think our membership quite understands that I can't hold my breath and make the employer give me more money. What are you willing to do to get more money? And I think, we've seen in the private sector and the public sector more strikes recently, and I do think people are fed up about the pennies that they're getting. And I know that I believe the OEA contract with the CEA contract with the Columbus School District, I believe, I thought I heard that 30% of those the members rejected what was seen as a fairly good raise, but in this economy with inflation was not. I mean, so I do think the unions are going to have a hard time selling 3s and 4s when the average wage increase in the private sector is like 5.8 or something like that at this point in time. It's between 5, 4, and 6, and inflation is at 7.1. So I think those come into play. So the bargaining dynamics. I'm just going to speak to the public sector here because that's my experience. We're in a situation where a lot of these contracts have been in place since the 1980s, and are pretty established. There shouldn't be a lot of changes needed unless you've had some operational issues caused by the language, what I've seen mostly from when I was on management side, a lot of the changes wanted because they want to pee on the fire hydrant and make their mark on the collective bargaining agreement. It's not necessarily driven by operational need, it's driven by politics. Again, like I said, what is the competition? What is the competition now? Is the competition other fire departments? Is it the whole labor market? And that's going to come into play. I think the competition is no longer just the comparable jobs. It's okay, what are they doing over here, and is that seen as a lesser job, or is that seen as an easier job? And how do we compete with that? The financial resources. A lot of public entities have a lot of money right now because of the ARP and things like that. But is it sustainable? So I think management tries to figure out what's sustainable, and the unions keep pushing for more money because they need more staff, and I don't think it's going to get any better. You know, if there's a strike, what is the cost or the lost production? If there's turnover, what is the cost of turnover? You know, and what's an acceptable amount of turnover and what's not an acceptable amount of turnover. And I think everybody needs to be realistic about what that really is, as opposed to saying, well, you know, we have a 33% turnover, but that's not really a problem. Or, you know, the union saying, well, you know, you had 3 people leave, and that's a big problem. You know, so I think the parties need to explore realistically the cost of turnover and lost production. You know, when you're on the union side, are they going to strike? Will they strike? Will they do? will they do that? And if they're not, then, you know, I mean, you're going to end up probably taking less than if the employer had a fear that they would walk out. And then, you know, past bargaining history comes into play, and that comes into play both in fact finding, it's in the statute. You know, how can you use what's happened in the past to leverage things in the future? So I found that being on the union side, there's a lot more bargaining dynamics in the internal committee. You know, and so there's a lot more bargaining within that structure of the caucus than there was when I was on management side, in terms of, you know, there was always input and advice and all that stuff, but there was always a decision that could be made, not necessarily voted on. On the union side, I find that's much more different. So on the external side, you have bargaining with the team that's on the other side. But you also have bargaining with the people that aren't at the table. You know, the politicians, the decision makers, all of that. So sometimes you have to try to see what their needs are, and how they're going to react to certain things. And so you have to be realistic there too. You know, vertical is bargaining at the various levels of the bargaining committee. So that's the internal. It goes upward. Horizontal is bargaining across the table with the other committee. Go ahead, Nina. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on the dimensions of horizontal and so ground rules. I think this is important. You try to establish some ground rules. Again, I do like having a gag rule when I was on management side during bargaining, because it allowed you to not have the public involved in the bargaining. Now, that may not always play right for the unions. You know, they may want to try to get the public on their side during the bargaining process, and they may not want to do that. And so I think that's a dynamic that happens. You know, a lot of our release time in the contract that I have are already written into the contract. Release time, pay for bargaining team, all that's already set forth in the collective bargaining agreement as opposed to individual agreement. But you can reach an individual agreement. each and every time you go to bargain, but if it's a long-standing process, most people establish those rules in their contract. Keeping minutes, each side usually keeps their own minutes. You know, I've done bargaining with ground rules where there's procedural ground rules written, and I've done bargaining without ground rules written, and it doesn't vary much. You know, the first meeting, you exchange all your issues, you make opening statements, your little elevator speech to set the tone for bargaining. You exchange a list of proposals and you go through and explain why you want or need each one. Early meetings, there's more explanation. There's movement on non-economic issues. On the perceived value of the issue. What I like to do is I try to identify what I think are easy issues to resolve and to build up some momentum. So I usually engage in an ABC analysis. What A issues are the easy ones, B are the medium ones, C is the really hard ones that's going to go with the money. And I try to identify those as we go through and try to deal with the easy issues up front, build up some momentum so that the team feels like they're making progress, hit the medium issues, again, resolve those in a probably a longer conversation to build up more momentum. So, you know, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? So you get your team to feel like there's movement. I think if they're in a good frame of mind and they believe people are trying to solve issues instead of stonewall, it's much easier to get to a deal. If the next slide, Linda. Okay. So in the negotiation process, how do you resolve differences within your team? Again, on this side of the table, it seems to be more of a vote. Sometimes, you know, the majority wins, or you try to build consensus around an issue. If you can do that, in the caucus, you consider modifying a position, exploring the information that helps you make a decision. Caucuses are private. You talk about strategies, your tactics. There is some playfulness in caucuses. There's, to relieve the tension. And there are times where you want to slow things down because if it starts going too fast, your team might think you're giving away the store. So, so you might want to call caucus, explain what's going on at the table, talk about where we can go, what the next few sessions look like.
Mike, we have a question from one of the attendees.
Yes.
How have you handled in the past when exchanging packages and the other side does not have a package, just says, we'll work with yours?
Well, I've never had that happen. I mean, in this negotiations that I'm dealing with now, I didn't have very many proposals. I had 4, and they wanted to rewrite the whole contract. So that could be a similar situation, but I've never experienced where one side didn't have something, so I've experienced where one side's had way less proposals than the other, but never nothing, and saying we'll just move with your proposals. They usually have to have a list of things that they want, at least. So I've never come across that. So.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the economics. I do think, you have to wrap up your hard issues with the economics. As the previous speaker spoke, everything has a price. So if when I was on management side, if there was things that we really wanted, that we could wrap in with the money to get, we would do that. So, I hate the game that gets played during bargaining, well, if you withdraw this proposal, I'll withdraw this one. And, so there's a lot of those proposals that are out there for that purpose. I do like where you can reach a solution, find the solution in the language and the economics, and see if you can get to a deal where everybody walks away. Maybe they're not happy, but they're not completely unhappy. I always thought a good deal was where both sides walked away and they were both happy, or a good deal was where both sides walked away and they were both unhappy. A bad deal is when one side walks away and is extremely happy and the other one is extremely unhappy, because I think that's a recipe for 3 years of unrest during the life of the contract, and then a horrendous round of bargaining the next time. So, do you need mediation? Sometimes it's easy. It's good to bring in a mediator. Maybe it's just to talk to your team. They're not listening to you. You can't convince them that they need to move. Maybe they need to hear it from somebody else. But I think, as adults, we should be able to to move in a way and to get to a solution without a third party. But that doesn't mean that that'll happen. Sometimes you need a mediator to deal with the other side because they're not listening to you, and sometimes you need a mediator to deal with your team because they're unrealistic. They're not hearing you because you work for them. And so, I found when I was on management side, more the mediator was used to move our team and their team, where the chief spokespersons knew where the deal lied. Bargaining issues, non-economic, economic, and housekeeping. Economic has a financial consequence. Non-economic is an issue that doesn't have necessarily a financial consequence. And housekeeping, I find it keeps getting expanded. Housekeeping used to be changes in grammar and cleanup and incorporation of small things that didn't really change the meaning. Now when employers tell me housekeeping, I see it as more substantive than that. And so I think if we got back to the traditional housekeeping, it would be better. Tentative agreement, that's just the agreement you reach at the table. It'll get incorporated into the overall agreement. Last best and final offer, don't use that lingo unless you really mean it. Because if this is your last best final offer and then 2 weeks later you come to me with your next last best final offer, I don't have any belief that you're credible. So your last best final offer is this is as far as we can. The next stage is fact finding, interest arbitration, or strike. The roll up, is the extra cost of your fringe benefits caused by wage increases. Like we have longevity in a contract, so if you change the wage rates, the longevity rates change, and so you know, that is something there. You know, position changes, you can say, I accept, you can modify the agreement, you can modify the position, you can withdraw it, you can write a counter, you can reject it. I find myself doing more rejection right now than I'm modifying. Resubmit, amend, or you can hold on to your position and not move.
Mike, it's 1:10. Can we have you do a summary, close?
Oh, well, I hope this was helpful. I mean, I think the biggest thing I think everybody should be thinking about is I do think staff shortages and the labor market are going to be our biggest issues as employers and union, because we do have a common interest there in trying to make sure that we can provide the services to the public, and we need to find a way to explore how do we get there. Like I said, I like the idea of stealing from the IBB and limiting the number of issues that are brought to the table, so that you don't have all this extraneous bull crap that eats up time at the table, that takes away from actually trying to reach a solution to a problem. And I think we're going to have to approach bargaining different than we have when you didn't have the scarcity of labor, and you could engage in that behavior. I think you know what's happening in the labor market is going to translate over into bargaining. Do we try to find our joint interests, and do we try to reach solutions, or do we try to do things like we always have and engage in this process, which there's a lot of gamesmanship, time eaten up, without real solutions to problems. You know, you may win, but does that solve the public's interest? And I don't think it will, because the public employers who say we don't have any money to help keep and retain people are going to be the same public employers who can't provide the services that the public expects. And so I think, you know, that's going to be an issue.
Mike, I do have one question for you.
Yes.
Do you believe, is it a ULP for a committee member to urge the membership to reject the TA?
No. You mean, unless they promise to go out and support the ratification of the agreement, a committee member in caucus can advocate the rejection of a TA. Why couldn't they? I mean, it's a democratic process.
Okay, that was a question.
On the other side, if they did that, they wouldn't be on the team.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you for stepping in for Joe.
I'm sorry, the slides, I wasn't really good with the slides. I only had a day to prepare for that, but I try to incorporate my thoughts with the slides so that you've got more substantive. The previous speaker's presentation raised a lot of issues that I tried to speak to. So I appreciate the time.
And we appreciate the knowledge that you have imparted to everyone. Even though you didn't have the short time to review the slides, you have a wealth of knowledge that just showed throughout the slide presentation. So on behalf of Colera, I thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And we are back next week. The topics are terms and conditions of employment, management's rights, as well as permissive and mandatory bargaining. So I hope to see everyone back. And yes, you can use the same link to come back on. Have a great weekend, everyone.